Ideas have consequences, for good and for ill. The history of the 20th century's various torments proved that defective understandings of the human person, human community, and human destiny were responsible for mountains of corpses and oceans of blood. If John Paul II could help the world get a firmer purchase on the truth of the human condition, in a way that was distinctly modern and grounded in the great philosophical tradition of the West, the future might be different. That was an excerpt from the book Witness to Hope by George Weigel. It's wonderfully written. It's a biographical masterclass at roughly 1,000 pages long. It was originally published in 1999, but is still to this day known as one of the most definitive biographies on then Pope John Paul II and now Saint John Paul II. Going right back into the book, John Paul II is born Karol Józef Wojtyła on May 18, 1920, in a small Polish town called Wadowicz, known for being one of the centers of Polish culture, drama, and literature, which has a profound impact on his development throughout his life. Karol would grow up a free man in a free Poland, a member of the first generation of Poles to be born in freedom in 150 years. He would never forget. It became part of the foundation on which he, too, would change the history of the 20th century. This is going to be one of the most recurring themes and one of the most profound themes that we're going to see throughout this book and throughout this podcast is freedom of religion, freedom from tyranny, freedom from oppression, freedom from totalitarian states. This is something that John Paul II is born into and then sees taken away throughout his life, so he knows how precious it is. And like many great saints, throughout his life, he experiences many hardships and sufferings, but he also has many examples of heroic virtue and holy people that he sees around him that he can strive to emulate. So his mother dies when he is in the 3rd grade. He's raised primarily by his father, who was a lieutenant in the Polish army. Going back to the book here, his son also remembers his father as a man of constant prayer. At night, as in the early morning, young Karol would find his father on his knees, silently praying. Father and son would read the Bible together and prayed the rosary regularly. We never spoke about a vocation to the priesthood, but his example was in a way my first seminary, a kind of domestic seminary. I think that this is critically important. While his father never even needed to say anything, just the way he lived, the way he prayed, and how holy he was enough to inspire his son to pursue a vocation of the priesthood, and he ultimately ends up becoming a pope and a saint. So this is super important as we start to reflect on our own lives. How can we make our own lives and our own families a kind of domestic seminary as well? So Karol Wojtyła has several other near misses and tragedies early in his life, besides his mother dying when he was very young. He's almost shot by a drunk man when he was 15. His older brother and only brother dies at the young age of 26 after having just recently graduated from medical school because he contracted one of the diseases of his patients. But despite these hardships, Karol was always a great student. He received top grades and was very early on absorbed by a passion for literature. This is something that as we continue to analyze saints and holy people, we're going to see that almost all of them have a similar dedication to learning. They have a curiosity, whether it's through literature or other things. They have this burning curiosity to learn. And I think that provides the fertile foundation for them to grow in their faith to the saints and the holy people that they end up becoming. So he's heavily influenced by Polish Romanticism, drama, and acting. The author acknowledges this very unique Polish attribute in describing its impact on the nation as a whole. He says here, Polish Romanticism acknowledged Catholicism as the yeast that had given rise to Poland's distinctive national character. To be revolutionary in this singular tradition, then, was to be intensely interested in Christian doctrine and morality. So this is something that we see that parts of our culture can be true, parts of our culture can, in a way, bring us closer to Christ, and that is what the author is saying here, that this Polish Romanticism, drama, and acting is actually the yeast that gives rise to Poland's distinct national character and its Catholicism. So Karol Wojtyła graduates from high school in 1938 and was his class valedictorian. He then moves to Krakow in the summer of 1938 with his father to study at the Jagiellonian University, which is one of the world's oldest and most distinguished universities in Poland. He initially studies philology, which is the study of languages. It's actually the same discipline that J.R.R. Tolkien studies and taught at Oxford. I think that this is important and cool to note, that this understanding of language, he masters many different languages throughout his papacy and throughout his life, but it also has a profound impact on his ministry. He's able to pick up language really quickly, and he's able to learn things in the language of native people, which makes a big difference when you're trying to speak with them and when you're trying to evangelize. After his first year at university in the spring of 1939, this is back to the book, he and some of his friends celebrated the successful completion of their first year of university studies with a party in the home of a classmate. There was wine and a gramophone and some dancing, but conversation was more important to Lolek. Lolek is one of the nicknames that his friends give him. This just reminds me how similar humans are across space and time. These are first-year college students that just passed their finals, and they want to have fun. They hang out and listen to music and have some wine. That is very similar to maybe what first-year college students may be doing now, but it's important to note that Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, is always different. He's set aside from this. The thing that was most important to him was encountering people and conversation. He wasn't there to party or to have fun. Then, in September of 1939, Germany invades Poland and World War II begins. Karol Wojtyła is in the middle of serving Mass as an altar boy when the sirens and bombings start. After Germany defeats the Polish army in a relatively quick fashion, Hans Frank, the German-placed new ruler of Poland, took his place in the royal castle and issued this statement. This is wild. "The Pole has no rights whatsoever. His only obligation is to obey what we tell him. He must be constantly reminded that his duty is to obey. A major goal of our plan is to finish off as speedily as possible all troublemaking politicians, priests, and leaders who fall into our hands. I openly admit that some thousands of so-called important Poles will have to pay with their lives, but you must not allow sympathy for individual cases to deter you and your duty, which is to ensure that the goals of National Socialism triumph and that the Polish nation is never again able to offer resistance. Every vestige of Polish culture is to be eliminated. Those Poles that seem to have Nordic appearances will be taken to Germany to work in our factories. Children of Nordic appearance will be taken from their parents and raised as German workers. The rest, they will work, they will eat, and in the end, they will die out. There will never again be a Poland." That is just insane. I honestly can't believe that anyone ever wrote something like that, but this sets the scene for what life is going to be like for Karol Wojtyła and his fellow Poles as they grow up in a German-occupied Poland. So throughout the course of the war, 3,646 Polish priests were imprisoned in concentration camps, of whom 2,647 were killed, which is almost all of them. 1,117 nuns were imprisoned, 238 were executed, and 25 died from other causes. This next sentence here is unbelievable. The concentration camp outside Munich became the world's largest monastery, housing at one time or another 1,474 Polish priests and hundreds from other occupied countries. Wow. So initially hoping that France and England and the other allies would invade Germany and help Poland out, Poland initially had hope. But when news of the French collapse before the Wehrmacht reached Poland, suicides took place in the manor house of Polish intelligentsia. That's like the Polish elite. And this is back to the book here. There would be no help. There would be no spring. Seemingly endless winter had set in. Poland was a nation under ice. That is great writing. Under German occupation, Karol's professors are sent to concentration camps, the majority of them at the Jagiellonian. Before This happens, though. His classmates refuse to stop and actually start their own studies underground. This is something that he is going to do throughout the occupation. During the day, he's forced to work as a manual laborer in a quarry, which also has profound impact on him and informs his papacy many years later. During this time, also, he's at the risk of being caught for violating the German and Nazi policies. But he forms a theater group despite this, where they create and perform their own plays as kind of their own form of resistance in maintaining their Polish culture that's centered around drama. On February 18th, 1941, Karol finds his father dead. This is back to the book. The priesthood began to loom larger as a way to live in resistance to the degradation of human dignity by brutal ideology. Now, an idea that would eventually become one of his deepest convictions began to take shape, that in the sometimes baffling designs of Providence, there is no such thing as mere coincidence. An orphan before his majority, his intellectual gifts, and his long-standing bent towards a life of prayer, the hardships he had endured during the occupation, his passion for theater, like the people who had touched his life most profoundly, these were not fragmentary incidents in a life, but signposts along a path pointing in the direction of the priesthood. It was not so much a question of his choosing this vocation against others. Throughout the spring and summer of 1942, the conviction grew in him that he had been chosen, and to that election there could be only one response. In the autumn of 1942, Karol walked to the 17th century residence of the Archbishop and asked to be received as a candidate for the priesthood. So he now starts a new double life as an underground seminarian, but his friends that he is in the acting groups with and theater groups with try to convince him not to become a priest because of his significant talent as an actor. One night, they stay up all night trying many different arguments to convince him not to, but this is a quote from the book. Karol refused to budge. He had been chosen. He could not decline the gift. So as the Germans continue to persecute the church and tighten their grip, Karol is nearly killed by a German truck, but luckily survives and is taken to the hospital. And he later escapes German capture and ends up staying with the Archbishop. The Archbishop helps to eliminate his background of working in the quarry so that the Nazis can't find him. And he lives at the Archbishop's house with his fellow seminarians and continues this domestic seminary again, the same term that popped up early on in relation to his father. The students got up at 6 a.m. for an hour of private prayer. Mass was celebrated at 7 a.m., with breakfast following. Classes were then held from 8:15 until noon in one of the Archbishop's drawing rooms. At 12 noon, students and faculty stopped to recite the Angelus in an act of contrition. Lunch and recreation in the Archbishop's garden followed. Around mid-afternoon, the students went to the chapel for 15 minutes of adoration before the Blessed Sacrament. This was followed by private study. At 6:30 p.m., the Archbishop would give a conference on a spiritual topic. Dinner was at 7 p.m. with evening prayer and personal devotions at 8:15. Then in January of 1945, Germany is starting to lose the war. And this is back to the book here. Nazi Germany leaves and the Soviet Union takes over immediately. Poland's liberation in 1945 was a euphemism. So despite the conflict here, Nazi Germany leaves and they basically just have new occupiers in the Soviet Union. Karol continues his pre-ordination theology undergraduate degree. Ultimately completing his undergraduate theology degree, he is ordained on All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1946, and then he arrives in Rome for his doctorate in late November 1946, and then passes his doctoral examinations and successfully defends his dissertation and was awarded the Doctor of Theology in December 1948 when he was just 28 years old. He then had a series of parish assignments early on in his priesthood where he's moved a couple of times, but in each parish he has the same impact. So, especially on young people. Karol, whose personal pattern of working 16 to 18-hour days was well established, energetically took up the challenge. He initiated a series of intellectual, liturgical, cultural, and pastoral innovations that changed the character of student chaplaincy in the Archdiocese of Krakow. rebutting point by point the effort by Poland's Stalinist rulers to reinvent the country's history and culture. Given the militant atheism promoted by the regime, it was essential to engage students intellectually. He never had a bank account, never wrote a check, never had any personal money. He slept on the floor and practiced other forms of self-discipline and self-denial. Possessions meant nothing to him. He always wore an old cassock and old shoes. Looking at him, you might think he was a beggar, a nobody. So during this time, he's constantly forming groups for young people around marriage prep, which was relatively unprecedented at the time, scripture, drama, engineering, physics, outdoor activities, which goes on to be one of his great loves, and he continues into his papacy. And he even continues to kayak and ski into his papacy as well. So these groups were, quote, a new kind of resistance movement, creating islands of free space in a totalitarian sea. We felt completely free with him, without any burden. His presence led us to express ourselves. While he was among us, we felt that everything was all right. We felt that we could discuss any problem with him. We could talk about absolutely anything. He had mastered the art of listening. He was always interested. Today, many priests try to be like the kids. We were trying to be like him. I think that is one of the most powerful lines. He is engaging these kids, not in an abstract sense, but in things that they enjoy within the culture. And he's doing so effectively that they want to be like him. He's not trying hard to come down to their level and to do things that they want to do that may not necessarily be in line with the faith. He is so on fire. He is so effective that they want to be like him. He is ordered to get his second philosophy doctorate in Rome so that he can start teaching as a professor, and ultimately graduates with that second doctorate in 1953. However, the 1950s continue to be a time of persecution of the church under the communist regime in Poland. This is back to the book here. The point of maximum confrontation came in May 1953, when the government announced that the state would henceforth appoint and remove bishops and pastors and require all priests to take a loyalty oath to the Polish People's Republic. In a fiery sermon at St. John's Cathedral in Warsaw, the primate of Poland threw down the gauntlet. We teach that it is proper to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God what is God's. But when Caesar seats himself on the altar, we respond, he must not. The regime labeled the memorandum high treason. On the night of September 25th and 26th, 1953, the Polish cardinal was arrested and interned. So throughout this time, Father Karol Wojtyła continues to teach as a professor. He donates his salary anonymously to fund a scholarship fund to help students pay for their education. This is, quote, they were mesmerized by him. He not only dressed like no one else on the faculty, he taught like no one else on the faculty. This was not the transmission of information. This was intellectual exploration. That's so cool. So in speaking about some of his lectures and his time as a professor, I wanted to include this conversion story that I thought was just crazy, so I'm going to read the whole thing. 20-year-old Waldera started to give the professor an earful. The professor is John Paul II. He had just come to the seminary from the law faculty at the university, where he had been successfully propagandized by Marxist theoreticians, then riding high. Full of the certainty of adolescence and crammed with Marxist vocabulary, he attacked the professor's ideas and the church's social teachings so vehemently that several classmates, appalled, started kicking him on the ankle and whispering, "Stop it, they will expel you." During young Waldera's tirade, the professor kept pacing back and forth on the platform at the front of the hall, his hands behind his back and his head down. The youngster finally fell back into his chair, sweating, the pent-up frustrations of the past months spent. The room was filled with a heavy silence. Father Karol Wojtyła stopped his pacing, stood at the center of the platform, and proceeded to flabbergast everyone in the room, especially Waldera. "Gentlemen, if you please, your attention. What your colleague has just said here is evidence that he is beginning to think theologically." He then met every one of Waldera's points, never raising his voice, answering each question that had been raised. After class was over, Father invited Waldera to the seminary parlor for a conversation. He had sensed a disturbance in the young man, and he wanted to help. A quarter century later, Waldera remembered his professor's kindness and tried to emulate it whenever he had to deal, as a priest, with the revolutionary hotheads of another generation. This is absolutely fascinating. Waldera, the student, is captivated by Marxist ideology, like many at the time, but the author very subtly and beautifully indicates his conversion and ultimate vocation of the priesthood there with just a couple words. I actually wasn't sure if I was reading this incorrectly, and I had to look it up. I looked it up. This is a true story. This man actually did end up converting and pursuing the priesthood and becoming a priest, which is super cool. In August 1958, Father Karol Wojtyła was on a kayaking trip with his youth ministry friends when he got an immediate notice in the mail along the trip to report back to the cardinal in Warsaw. He had been nominated the youngest bishop ever in Poland at the age of 38. He receives this news with relative shock and then immediately takes it to prayer. This is, quote, "They led him to their chapel and left him alone. After some time, the nuns began to worry and quietly opened the door of the chapel to see what was happening. Father Wojtyła was prostrate on the floor in front of the tabernacle. The sister left, thinking that perhaps he was a penitent. Some hours later, they came back. The unknown priest was still prostrate before the Blessed Sacrament. It was late, and one of the nuns said, 'Perhaps Father would like to come to supper?' The stranger answered, 'My train doesn't leave for Krakow until after midnight. Please let me stay here. I have a lot to talk about with the Lord.'" So now Bishop Wojtyła, after accepting the nomination, leaves for Vatican II on October 5th, 1962. He's just 42 years old and ends up speaking each of the 4 sessions, and this has a profound impact on him and the council itself. In one of those statements, he says, "The Church, in dialogue with the world, always looked at history through the prism of the redeeming cross of Christ. That God has entered the created world to redeem it," Wojtyła continued, "has fixed once and for all the Christian meaning of the world. The world was not something external to the Church, nor were creation and redemption somehow extrinsic to the world, its history and its aspiration. The story of creation and redemption is the world's story, properly understood. Telling the world's story as that kind of story and thus bringing the world to conversion was the greatest service the Church could do for the world." So others commented on his presence at Vatican II, saying, "Wojtyła made a remarkable impression. His personality dominates. Some kind of animation is present in this person, a magnetic power, prophetic, strength, full of peace, and impossible to resist." That's major foreshadowing. He's then installed as Archbishop of Krakow, March 8th, 1964, at the extremely young age of 43, but this comes as a result of a pretty incredible story here. So despite many public sermons that directly contradicted the communist ideology, the communists vetoed every submission by the Pope and confessed to others that they were going to veto them until they received the name of Karol Wojtyła. So they incorrectly assume that because he is young, that he is also naive and that he will bend to their will. They don't know that in that advocacy, in their vetoing of other people, they just advocated for the installation of one of the most impactful Catholics, one of the most impactful Christians, and perhaps one of the most impactful human beings in the entire 20th century, and especially in the Cold War. They also don't know that they had advocated for the installation of a saint who would go on to play a significant role in the downfall of communism in Europe. So as Archbishop now, he takes on a symbolic role as well. To be the successor of Saint Stanislaw, who is the patron saint of Poland and was martyred, was to be the heir of an ancient tradition in which the bishop was the defender of the people, the defender of the city, and their last resort. That's super cool. He focuses on several different priorities during his time as Archbishop. He installs churches in their model communist Polish worker towns, where they were the first towns built in Poland without a church. He reinvigorates their Corpus Christi procession that was previously outlawed under the communist government, and then makes significant efforts to grow the seminary despite state persecution. Here's a little glimpse into his life as Archbishop. The Archbishop rose at 5 or 5:30 every morning and spent the first hour of his day in private prayer. After Mass in the chapel with his secretary, personal staff, and sometimes invited guests, he had breakfast in the kitchen and then retired to the chapel, where he spent 2 hours every morning between 9 and 11 writing. The period between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. was reserved for visitors, and the rule was that anyone who wanted to see the cardinal could come. Lunch followed. Afternoons and evenings were devoted to more meetings, to visitations around the city or the region, and to reading and to study. He had no television, but listened to Radio Free Europe's Polish service on a small radio while shaving in the morning. To make maximum use of his travel time, he had a desk and lamp rigged up in the backseat of his car so he could read or write while being driven to an appointment. The mainspring of his daily energy was his constant prayer. I think that continues the common thread in his life of being curious, even going to the lengths of setting up a desk in his car so that he can study and continue to read and learn. Another attribute that we see demonstrated here is his seemingly superhuman ability to work hard. He's working insane hours, and of course, all of those hours are committed to his people and growing his diocese and helping his people. In June of 1967, Pope Paul IV makes Archbishop Wojtyła a cardinal at the exceptionally young age of 47. Again, his track record of being elevated to these positions of tremendous responsibility, typically held by men much older than him, is foreshadowing for his ultimate destiny. The author describes it here. At this time, he's speaking about how the possibility of him becoming pope, which at this time is not considered a possibility. Here was an intellectually astute and articulate pastor who could speak Christian truth to the majority in a dialogue that really was a two-way street. A sensible world, some of them may have thought, would want to see this man pope, but that, of course, wasn't possible. So now Cardinal Wojtyła communicates the same thing that you are trying to accomplish here in this quote that I think is super cool. Saints are the best catechists because effective religious education does not simply take place through the transmission of ideas, but the example of heroic virtue. So he articulates perfectly exactly what the goal of this podcast is. By studying and learning about the biographies of saints and holy people, it is really the best catechism that we can have. Of course, it's very important to know our faith as well, but it's really where you encounter Christ, where you encounter holiness, is by seeing the example of heroic virtue in others. And we're definitely seeing this in John Paul II's life. So then on August 6, 1978, Pope Paul IV dies, and Cardinal Luciani is elected on the first day of voting, August 26, 1978, and takes the name John Paul I, but his papacy is very short-lived. Back to the book here. Early on the morning of September 29, 1978, was one of the household sisters found Pope John Paul I dead in his bed, where he had been stricken the night before by a massive heart attack. The September papacy was over, and the church was once again plunged into crisis. In the aftermath of 2 papal deaths within less than 2 months, there was renewed discussion of a non-Italian pope. A Western European was unlikely because the church there was divided into 2 post-conciliar factions, and electing someone from one would cause trouble with the other. A pope from the Third World was a possibility, but more likely in the future. So the question, where and for whom to look for in Europe? Wojtyła was a European from another world. The Polish church, the church of a praying country, was strong at a time when the universal church was in crisis. Polish Catholicism was very much a church of the people of God. So Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, at that time, who ultimately goes on to become Pope Benedict, says here, "What is God's will for us at this moment? We were convinced that the election of Luciani was made in correspondence with the will of God, not simply in a human way. And after being elected in accordance with the will of God, he died. God has something to say to us. The shock of the September papacy, so abruptly and unexpectedly ended, created the human conditions for the possibility of doing something new." So then, on the second day of voting during the papal enclave following the death of Pope John Paul I, October 16th, 1978, the cardinal in charge walks to and stands in front of Archbishop Karol Wojtyła's desk and says, "Do you accept the election?" There was no hesitation. Karol Wojtyła knew the seriousness of the times and the weight of the responsibility that was being laid upon him, but he saw in his brother's votes the will of God. In the obedience of faith before Christ my Lord, abandoning myself to the Mother of Christ and the Church, and conscious of the great difficulties, I accept. Then, to the second ritual question as to what name he would be known, he answered that because of his devotion to Paul IV and his affection for John Paul I, he would now be known as John Paul II. So this is absolutely crazy. It's the first non-Italian pope in 455 years and the first Slavic pope ever, first pope from Poland. On international television and across the world, John Paul II begins his papacy with a quote directly from Scripture saying, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," directly quoting Matthew chapter 16, verse 16, where St. Peter answers Jesus when he asks him who he says that he is. So people back home in Poland, understandably so, celebrate and go crazy, cry, hug each other, and the world as a whole marvels at the first non-Italian pope, like I said, in 455 years, and the first Slavic pope ever. The communists and the KGB, however, are concerned at what this will mean. This is a quote from the book here. An eminent Italian journalist with good Soviet connections was recorded as saying the Soviets would prefer Alexander Solzhenitsyn as Secretary General in the United Nations than a Pole as Pope. This is hilarious. It's, of course, sarcasm. If you don't know who Alexander Solzhenitsyn is, he wrote the book The Gulag Archipelago, which is chronicling his time in the Soviet gulags, and of course is very critical of the Soviet communist system. So they're saying that they would rather have him as the Secretary General of the United Nations than have a Pole as Pope. He had come to Peter City prepared to spend out his life in service to the truth that human beings redeemed in Christ were so much greater than they imagined. So John Paul does many unprecedented things throughout his papacy, and in addition to his not being from Italy, he travels the world. He continues his outdoor activities, skiing and kayaking, and then he also has a new approach to international politics as well. This is a quote from the book, in which the conversion of culture was the first priority and religious freedom was the non-negotiable litmus test of a just society. There are many parallels to how John Paul II's approach in his ministry through evangelizing the culture is actually very similar to how Bishop Barron approaches his ministry in Word on Fire, that you can truly convert the world, you can engage the world through the culture. So in preparation for his first pilgrimage to Poland after being elected Pope, the Polish Communist Party sent out this secret set of instructions to some of the teachers saying, the Pope is our enemy. Due to his uncommon skills and great sense of humor, he is dangerous because he charms everyone, especially journalists. Besides, he goes for cheap gestures in his relations with the crowd. For instance, he puts on a Highlander's hat, shakes all hands, kisses children. It is modeled on an American presidential campaign. Then, in June 1979, in one of the greatest sermons Pope John Paul II ever delivers, this is in Victory Square during his pilgrimage back to Poland that the communists were so scared about. There can be no just Europe without the independence of Poland marked on its map. Polish soldiers have fallen on numerous battlefields for our freedom and yours. Was history thus absurd? No. For that spirit of sacrifice was emblematic of every seed that falls into earth and dies, and then bears fruit. It may be the seed of the blood of a soldier shed on the battlefield, or the sacrifice of martyrdom in concentration camps or in prison. It may be the seed of the hard daily toil in the field, the workshop, the mine, the foundries, the factories. It may be the seed of the love of parents who do not refuse to give life to a new human being and undertake the whole task of bringing him up. It may be the seed of creative work in the universities, the higher institutes, the libraries, and the places where the national culture is built. It may be the seed of prayer, the service of the sick, the suffering, and the abandoned, all of that which Poland is made. Poland was not a communist country. Poland was a Catholic nation saddled with a communist state. Poland's second baptism, which would change the history of the 20th century, had begun. So the communists are very rightfully so scared of John Paul II because of sermons like that, which are completely contradictory to what they are espousing and inspires the people to something contrary to what they need them to do. So someone else, in describing the impact the Pope's pilgrimage had, I think this is one of the best quotes in the entire book, says, "People felt and acted out the change before they could articulate what had happened to them. Without thinking much about it, they began behaving differently. Those very people who were ordinarily frustrated and aggressive in the shop were transformed into cheerful and happy collectivity. People failed with dignity. Exemplary order reigned everywhere. Communism had promised solidarity among the masses and had produced atomization, ill humor, and distress. We might have to live and die under communism, but now what I wanted to do was live without being a liar. People had come to the fundamental decision during the papal pilgrimage, let's stop lying." It's amazing that just the presence of someone can have that impact on people, but that is the impact that he had on Poland, and that's the impact that he had on the entire world. So then John Paul II continues his pilgrimages all over the world, Asia, Africa, Europe, and the United States. And here's a really cool story about an Iowa farmer and the power in just being willing to ask a question. So John Paul flew to Iowa in the American heartland. Des Moines had not been on the original schedule, but the Pope had received a handwritten letter from a farmer, Joe Hayes, inviting him to visit the country's agricultural center. John Paul agreed, and a frantic 5 weeks of preparation began. A 10-foot banner and burnt orange, blue, green, and red from the backdrop to the altar platform had been crafted by 15 volunteers during a 2-week-long quilting bee. Under the Midwestern sky, to the largest crowd in the history of Iowa, John Paul took the bounty of the earth and the starting point for the most moving homily of his American pilgrimage, a reflection on the bounty of Christ, satisfying the hunger of humanity in the Eucharist. Farmers provide bread for humanity, but it is Christ alone who is the bread of life. Even if all the physical hunger of the world were satisfied, even if everyone who is hungry were fed by his or her own labor by the generosity of others, the deepest hunger of man would still exist. Therefore, come to Christ. He is the bread of life. Come to Christ, and you will never again be hungry. A local Protestant minister from Granger, Iowa, then tells his neighbor, Joe Hayes, "You've got a pope who knows how to pope," which is a very simple way of saying John Paul II is very special. So then John Paul II's last visit on his American pilgrimage is to Washington, D.C., where he has a historic meeting with the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. After an hour-long discussion, Pope and President met 6,000 guests on the south lawn of the White House, where Carter spontaneously created what Time magazine later referred to as one of the most moving moments of his presidency. Speaking Christian to Christian, the Georgia Baptists, the Polish Catholic, as human beings, each acting for justice in the present and striving together for a common future of peace and love, let us not wait so long for ourselves, for you and I to meet again. Welcome to our country, our new friend. John Paul II then embraces the president, and everyone erupts into a prolonged applause. But as John Paul II continues to grow in popularity, he continues to inspire the world and strive for unification in the East, which is a direct threat to the Soviet Empire. And an official Soviet report complaining that the Vatican had begun to use religion in the ideological struggle against the Soviet lands. Something had to be done. On November 13th, 1979, the Soviet Central Committee gave its approval to a proposed decision to work against the policies of the Vatican in relation with socialist states. So this is like a direct plan to take action to undermine the Vatican. The plan contained several different objectives, but its final and potentially most sinister was the goal of the KGB to show that the new leadership of Pope John Paul II was dangerous to the Catholic Church. So they're trying to subvert the church from within. And then 2 weeks after this virtual declaration of war against John Paul, and it was approved at the highest levels of the Soviet state authority. A young Turkish terrorist recently escaped from prison. Mehmet Ali Agca sent a letter to the Istanbul newspaper. He claimed, deeply offended by the Pope's pending pilgrimage to Turkey, a ruse by Western imperialists to deploy the commander of the Crusades against Turkey and her Islamic nations. If this is not cancelled, Agca concluded, I will, without a doubt, kill the Pope, chief. This is the sole motive for my escape from prison. The shadowland surrounding the pontificate of John Paul II was becoming more populated. That's crazy verbiage, but well articulates the growing darkness of the time and the target that starts to become on John Paul II's back as he has more of a significant impact on the world. So then, on May 13th, 1981, a glorious spring afternoon, like 20,000 others, Mehmet Ali Agca, the 23-year-old Turk, was going to St. Peter's Square, where John Paul II was giving a weekly audience. Agca was not the typical pilgrim. 2 years before, this is what I had previously mentioned, 2 years before, on February 1st, 1979, he had assassinated the editor of the respected Istanbul Daily. With his trial unfinished, Agca escaped from the maximum security prison dressed as a soldier. 3 days later, he wrote the infamous letter threatening to kill the Pope. He then goes on May 11th and May 12th to St. Peter's Square to study the venue. And along with thousands of pilgrims and Romans, he went back the next afternoon. The huge piazza was divided into sections by short wooden barricades that formed an impromptu motorway along which John Paul II would be driven in his open-air Pope-mobile to greet the crowd. Mehmet Ali Agca found a spot just behind a row of pilgrims pressed against one of the barricades, no more than 10 feet from where the Pope would pass, and waited. So that's where I'll end for now. I'll come out with a part 2 where I'm covering the second half of John Paul II's life, the remainder of his papacy. Again, the book is titled Witness to Hope by George Weigel. I'll leave a link to it in the description and the show notes of this podcast. If you would like to support the podcast, purchase the book through that link. And there are many more stories and details that I don't cover here, so I would highly recommend getting the book. But thank you very much, and Deo gratias.